An entire lake's population of fish has been executed. Not by a chemical spill, not by an algae bloom, but by a legally binding contract. On June 5, 2026, the San Carlos Recreation and Wildlife Department announced the indefinite closure of San Carlos Lake, a famed Arizona fishery. Inside, an estimated 100% of its fish had suffocated overnight. All of them. The catastrophe's timing was a particular form of cruelty. The very next day was Arizona's statewide free fishing day. Families arrived at the shoreline expecting a day of sport and trophy bass, and instead were met by the stench of a toxic graveyard, a 158-mile ring of decaying fish, baking under the Arizona sun. The official statement from the tribe's wildlife department was stark, clinical. Recent drought conditions, combined with water releases from the dam, have resulted in a major fish kill affecting approximately 100% of the fish population within the lake. But that single sentence masks the true mechanism of the collapse. The fish did not simply run out of water to swim in. They were not left gasping on cracked mud. The reality is far stranger. They died because the water itself turned against them. As a lake gets shallower, its volume shrinks, and the summer sun heats the remaining water like a pot on a stove. Warmer water cannot hold dissolved oxygen. The fish were packed into shrinking, warming pools, and in unison, an entire ecosystem ran out of air. They suffocated to death, underwater. It's a strange phenomenon to think about. An entire lake asphyxiating. I'm curious if you've heard of this happening anywhere else. To understand what happened in June of 2026, you must first understand the life and death of the lake itself. The warning signs had been flashing for months. On April 3, 2026, tribal officials issued a dire alert. San Carlos Lake, with a full capacity of over 930,000 acre-feet of water, had dwindled to just 1.93%. Shallow pools remained, but the vast expanse of what was once a 19,500-acre reservoir was gone, exposed. But here is the detail that tells the real story. Even at 1.93% capacity, releases of water downstream were continuing. The lake was being actively drained. The killing blow was not an accident of nature. It was an act of infrastructure. Presiding over the lake is the Coolidge Dam, a massive multiple-dome reinforced concrete structure built on the Gila River. It was a project of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Constructed between 1924 and 1928, an engineering marvel of its time. On March 4, 1930, President Calvin Coolidge himself arrived in Arizona to dedicate the dam that bore his name. With him was the era's most famous social commentator, the humorist Will Rogers. They stood together and looked out not at a sparkling new reservoir, but at an empty, dusty basin. The Gila River had not yet provided enough water to fill it. Surveying the vast, dry expanse dotted with cattle, Will Rogers delivered a line that would become a dark prophecy for the lake. He joked, "If this was my lake, I'd mow it." For nearly a century, that single line has captured the essence of San Carlos Lake. It has always existed on a knife's edge between a vibrant fishery and a field of grass. The lake sits entirely within the 1.8 million acre San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation. But the water inside it does not belong exclusively to the tribe. This is the part the headlines do not capture. Under a century-old legal framework known as the San Carlos Apache Irrigation Project, the reservoir functions as a holding tank for downstream agricultural users. Towns like Coolidge, Florence, and Casa Grande, built on the promise of irrigated desert farming, hold legal rights to the water stored behind the Coolidge Dam. The agency that manages these claims is the San Carlos Irrigation and Drainage District, or SCID. Its business manager, Brandy Ogle, oversees the allotments. When downstream farmers need their legally entitled water for crops like alfalfa and cotton, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which operates the dam, is required by law to open the gates. It must drain the lake, regardless of its elevation, regardless of the ecological consequences for the reservation. It is a system designed for agriculture, not for the survival of a lake. This boom and bust cycle has been a feature of San Carlos Lake for its entire existence. In the last century, it has been drained down to what is called dead pool levels, so low that water can no longer flow out through gravity, more than 20 times. 20 times, the ecosystem has been nearly or completely wiped out, only to be painstakingly restocked with fish by the Arizona Game and Fish Department, or AZGFD, and the tribe's own wildlife managers. Each time the lake refills, it becomes a legendary fishery once more. The shallow, nutrient-rich waters created by the cycle lead to explosive growth. San Carlos Lake has, against all odds, produced an incredible number of state record-holding fish. Trophy lineages of largemouth bass, black crappie, and flathead catfish. All of that genetic history, all of those decades of careful stocking and management, were erased in a matter of days in June of 2026. This system, which sets up a conflict between the ecological health of the reservation and the economic needs of downstream communities, has been in place for generations. But something has changed. For most of its history, a complete collapse was a generational event. Disasters were documented, but they were spaced far apart. A major fish kill in 1996, another in 2003, then again in 2012. The intervals were long enough for recovery, for the lake to live again. Then, the cycles began to accelerate. The 23-year megadrought that settled over the American Southwest at the turn of the century tightened its grip. The periods of recovery grew shorter. The periods of drought grew longer and more intense. The 2026 catastrophe was not an isolated event. It was the brutal culmination of an accelerating trend. Just weeks before San Carlos collapsed, a smaller fishery nearby, Clough Ranch Ponds, suffered a similar total fish kill. The same mechanism: shallow water, intense heat, and sudden total anoxia. It was a prelude. A smaller domino falling just before the larger one. The lake was not just the victim of a flawed legal structure. It was the victim of that structure colliding with a rapidly changing climate. The system was always brittle. The megadrought provided the hammer. These hidden water wars, where century-old laws clash with modern climate realities, are playing out all across the American West. You can subscribe if you want to see more stories that uncover these invisible battlegrounds. Zoom out, and the crisis at San Carlos Lake reveals itself to be a microcosm of a much larger emergency. It is a single, dying cell in a vast failing organism. That organism is the Colorado River Basin. Travel just a few hundred miles north, and you find the behemoths of the system. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the two largest reservoirs in the United States, and they are both in a state of terminal decline. In May of 2026, just as San Carlos was entering its final deadly phase, officials at the Salt River Project, another major Arizona utility, announced that Theodore Roosevelt Lake, a critical reservoir for central Arizona, had plummeted to just 43% capacity. This was after a winter with record low runoff. The snowpack that is supposed to be the lifeblood of the desert had failed to materialize. But the true existential threat hangs over Lake Powell. Lake Powell is the nation's second largest reservoir, a massive body of water straddling the Arizona-Utah border, held back by the Glen Canyon Dam in Page, Arizona. Its total capacity is a staggering 24 million acre-feet. The dam is more than just a plug. It is a massive hydroelectric power plant. The water flowing through its turbines generates carbon-free electricity for approximately 5 million people across 6 western states. But for the turbines to spin, the lake's surface has to be high enough. That critical threshold is called the minimum power pool elevation, which for Glen Canyon Dam is 3,490 feet above sea level. In the spring of 2026, the lake's surface was just feet above that number and falling. Projections from the Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that manages the dam, warned that hydropower generation could be forced to halt entirely as early as December 2026. Sarah Porter, the director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University, has been one of the most prominent voices sounding the alarm. She warns that the loss of power from Glen Canyon would disproportionately devastate tribal nations and rural electrical cooperatives, which rely heavily on its affordable electricity. They would be forced to buy power on the open market at much higher prices, crippling local economies. The lights would not go out in Phoenix or Los Angeles immediately. The first to feel the impact would be the most vulnerable communities on the grid. It is an energy crisis quietly nested inside a water crisis. Downstream from Lake Powell lies the largest reservoir of them all, Lake Mead. Held back by the Hoover Dam, an icon of American engineering, Lake Mead supplies water to Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California. It is the lifeblood of Las Vegas and a critical resource for millions of acres of farmland. John Ensminger, the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, has spent years in tense negotiations over the dwindling supply. He and other water managers have watched the lake drop toward its own point of no return, dead pool. For Lake Mead, that elevation is 1,050 feet. At that point, water can no longer flow past Hoover Dam at all. In mid-2026, Experts watching the real-time data warned that Lake Mead was, in their words, barreling faster than ever towards system crash. The story of San Carlos Lake, a fishery on a tribal reservation, is inextricably linked to the fate of these massive reservoirs and the 40 million people who depend on them. The same megadrought, the same failed snowpack, the same rising temperatures. San Carlos is simply the canary in a very, very deep coal mine. It's a story that affects millions of people who might not even know it yet. It might be a good idea to share this with someone who lives in the Southwest. The entire system is governed by a document signed more than a century ago, the Colorado River Compact of 1922. It was negotiated during an abnormally wet period in the region's history, and it allocated more water to the 7 western states than the river actually carries in an average year. For decades, the deficit was manageable. The massive reservoirs, Mead and Powell, acted as savings accounts, storing water from wet years to be used in dry ones. But the 23-year megadrought has drained those accounts. Now, there is no buffer left. The 7 states are divided into 2 groups, the Upper Basin, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, and the Lower Basin, Arizona, California, and Nevada. And they are deadlocked. The guidelines for how to manage shortages agreed upon in 2007 are expiring. Negotiations for the post-2026 world have stalled, mired in a desperate fight for survival. The Upper Basin states argue the Lower Basin has been using more than its fair share for decades and must now face reality. The Lower Basin, particularly Arizona and California, argues that deep, sudden cuts would devastate their cities and their multi-billion-dollar agricultural industries. Arizona is in a particularly dangerous position. Because of the seniority of California's water rights, Arizona is first in line for the most severe cuts. Some hydrologic models from 2026 showed a plausible future where a failure to reach a compromise would trigger a devastating Tier 2, a shortage, forcing Arizona to slash its Colorado River water allocation by as much as 77%. It is a number so large it is almost incomprehensible. It would mean turning off the taps for entire sectors of the state's economy. Brad Udall, a leading water and climate expert at Colorado State University's Colorado Water Center, looked at the standoff in June 2026 and saw a historical tipping point. Maybe this is the first worldwide climate change crisis, he said. That's going to force really fundamental policy-level decisions to be made. The crisis is no longer theoretical. It is not a projection for 2050. It is the mathematical reality of 2026. The water officials are no longer managing for drought. They are managing for a permanently hotter, drier future. A future with a smaller Colorado River. And this brings the story back to the cracked, blistering bed of San Carlos Lake. The legal framework that condemned the lake, the San Carlos Apache Irrigation Project, is a product of the same era as the Colorado River Compact, an era of magical thinking, when it was believed that concrete and contracts could conquer the desert, that water could be allocated on paper without regard for the physical limits of the source. The Coolidge Dam was built under the authority of the Winters Doctrine of 1908, a Supreme Court decision that affirmed that when the federal government creates an Indian reservation, it implicitly reserves enough water to fulfill the purposes of that reservation. In theory, this gives tribes what are known as senior water rights. First in line, but the history of water in the West is the history of powerful interests finding ways to subvert those rights. The complex legal structure at San Carlos, which pits the tribe's own on-reservation lake against the demands of a non-tribal irrigation district, is a testament to that century-long struggle. The tribe is both the landlord and a hostage in its own home. The June 5th closure notice from the San Carlos Recreation and Wildlife Department was more than just a warning to anglers. It was a declaration of system failure. It stated plainly, decomposing fish may pose health risks to individuals who enter the area or attempt to fish. The lake had become a biohazard. The water, rendered toxic by the sheer biomass of decay, was unsafe to touch. The air, unsafe to breathe. The irony is that the catastrophe revealed the incredible richness that was lost. The trophy bass and crappie that made the lake a destination fishery were now just part of the rotting slick that coated the shoreline. It represents a total loss of an ecological asset that took decades to build, wiped out by a decision made in an office miles away to release the last vestiges of its water. The questions that remain are haunting. There is no easy fix. A few summer thunderstorms will not refill a 930,000 acre-foot reservoir. That requires sustained, heavy runoff over many seasons, something the region has not seen in years and may not see again for a generation. Will the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Arizona Game and Fish Department attempt to restock the lake a 21st time? At what point does the effort become futile, like planting a garden in the path of a recurring flood? The cycle of refilling and draining has become a parody of ecological management. It highlights a fundamental conflict. Can a body of water simultaneously be a living lake and a passive irrigation tank? The events of 2026 suggest the answer is no. One function must ultimately kill the other. As the managers of the Colorado River system face their own day of reckoning, they are grappling with the same core problem. The river they have on paper is not the river that exists in the world. The legal agreements of 1922 cannot force snow to fall in the Rockies. The post-2026 guidelines, whatever they end up being, will not make the river whole again. They will simply be a framework for managing scarcity, for deciding who gets less and who gets nothing at all. John Ensminger, Terry Fulp, Brad Udall, Sarah Porter, these are not just names in a newspaper. They are the people in the rooms where a new map of the American West is being drawn. A map defined by what water is left. The story of San Carlos Lake is a severe, localized symptom of this larger disease. It is what happens when a system with no margin for error finally runs out of time. The decisions made in the coming months about Lake Powell's power generation and the broader Colorado River allocations will echo for a century. They will determine which cities can continue to grow, which farms will be left to turn to dust, and which communities will have to pay more just to keep the lights on. The joke Will Rogers made in 1930 feels less like a joke now. It feels like a diagnosis, an empty lake waiting to be mowed. The final data point from San Carlos Lake is perhaps the most chilling. The official notice was posted on June 5th, but the kill likely happened over the preceding days, as the last pools warmed past a point of no return. We know that on April 3rd, the lake was at 1.93%. The final releases of water pushed it over the edge. An entire world teeming with life was erased not with a bang, but with the slow, silent turning of a valve, dictated by a contract written before the Great Depression. A contract that has no clause for a megadrought, or for the survival of a lake. 3 questions now hang over the Gila River Basin and the entire desert Southwest. How do you honor century-old water rights when the water they promised no longer exists? What is the breaking point for a system that supports 40 million people